He found him with an ice pick halfway in a patient's brain. Ask Reddit on Reddit Rundown. What are some downright disturbing facts you know? The Japanese brutalities during the Nanjing massacre were so extreme, the head Nazi representative in the region complained directly to Hitler about it. When filming Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory in Germany in 1970-71, they had trouble casting the Oompa Loompas, as people who suffered with disabilities were simply killed by the Nazis during the war. Somebody replied. Also, the children in the movie got paid next to nothing, the pay didn't even cover their travel expenses. They also didn't even get an invite to the premiere of the movie and had to buy their own tickets. The foam that came out of the boat in the candy room also caused health problems, and many of the actors had to go to the hospital because the foam was actually fire extinguisher foam. Also, the tunnel for the chocolate river with all the scary imagery and Wonka just sitting there was so scary for the children that a lot of them were scarred by it. Lobotomies were a complete guessing game, and the procedure's success was mostly based on whether or not the patient was deemed calm and quiet post-surgery. Walter Freeman, the man who popularized lobotomies in America, wasn't even a surgeon. He had to partner with an actual surgeon to attempt the procedure. But Freeman didn't care for the length of the surgery. So he invented the ice pick lobotomy. Use an ice pick to access the brain by hammering the pick through the bone above the eye and near the nose, and then just wiggling it around. As stated before, Freeman was not a surgeon. So when the actual surgeon he partnered with walked into their shared office, to find Freeman with an ice pick halfway in a patient's brain, their partnership ended immediately. But that didn't stop Freeman from continuing his work with lobotomies. He toured the nation in a van he called the Lobotomobile, offering the procedure to insane asylums with problem patients. Freeman completed over 3,000 lobotomies throughout his career, of which nearly 500 patients died and 1,000 were left in a vegetative state. Ever thought about how whales and dolphins die? When they get too old and too weak to swim up to the surface to breathe, they start to slowly sink towards the deep, cold depths of the ocean, and suffocate in the dark. Somebody replied. Interesting sidebar to this. The size thresholds for animals that die like this is studied in detail by engineers because their corpse will exist at such a high pressure that the carbon compounds they decomposed into will be heavier than water. This means that all the carbon they consume in their lives will be extracted from the atmosphere and stored in the ocean in a carbon pool. Encouraging the growth of the populations over this threshold is thought to be a key to reducing the CO2 in the atmosphere. I spent $100K on a master's and that's the only thing I remember. Hundreds of dead babies were found in the septic tank of a mother and baby home in Tuam, Ireland. No one has any idea how many children died under the system countrywide, or how many children were forcibly taken from their mothers and sold to childless families abroad. Somebody replied. A lot of these babies' mothers were pressured into giving them up, either by the church for being single mothers, or by fathers who couldn't afford to feed the kids. Many were promised when they were in better situations, they would be given their kids back. Lots of the children sold abroad were indentured servants, they weren't even adopted out of charity or to make up for parents not being able to have kids of their own. They were often made to work on farms and in factories, while still children. They could eventually potentially buy their freedom, provided they scraped up enough cash. For some, joining World War I was an escape route from being a servant for life. When the German battleship Bismarck went down after hours of constant battering, 1,500 of the 2,000-men crew were able to jump into the ocean. The Royal Navy rescued 500 of them, but left early due to lack of fuel and the threat of submarines. Over 1,000 men were left on the ocean to die, having just survived pure hell. Today the area of the wreck is littered with thousands of leather boots, having once belonged to the crew which died because they were abandoned. The average age of the crew was little over 20 years. The crew of Challenger likely survived over a minute after the initial explosion. They were killed by the impact on the water. There is evidence that members of the crew even started trying to complete emergency procedures. The report from the New York Times about how the bodies were found is also disturbing. The compartment was little more than a pile of rubble on the ocean floor, 8 feet high and 50 feet across. They said the astronauts' remains were crushed inside the debris and could not be recognized as human. Federal investigators studying the wreckage believe the crew compartment fell intact nearly 9 miles to the surface of the sea, where it shattered on impact. There was a serial killer in the 19th to 20th century who murdered, raped, and cannibalized children and would send letters to their parents describing how their children tasted. Truly one of the most sickening men in recent memory. His name was Albert Fish. He engaged in every single paraphilia you can think of, and he killed up to 100 people. He preferred to rape, murder and eat mainly Afro-American/disabled boys under the age of 6. His last crime before getting caught was sending a letter to a mother in which he elaborated how he killed and ate her daughter. He only did send a letter like that once, and some speculate that he did that hoping to be caught. Researchers in the 70s kept a dolphin in a flooded basement and gave it acid and jerked it off to try and teach it to speak English. The dolphin committed suicide because it fell in love with the handler that jerked it off. When your immune system recognizes that you have eyes, you'll turn blind. And there's nothing you can do about it. Somebody replied, "When my husband put a nail through his right eye with a table saw, the retina specialist said that his body might determine that his good eye was also injured, and that if that began to happen, we'd have about a day to decide whether to nucleate, remove, the injured eye before the proteins fully attacked the good eye and rendered him fully blind." Luckily, it did not happen, and he kept one good eye. In the 90s, a British Airways pilot was sucked out of the cockpit at 23,000 feet due to a poorly installed window seal failure, and he got pinned against the airplane as the flight attendants tried to keep him from completely getting sucked away, but he survived, suffering only a few bone fractures and frostbite. I've talked about this before. Motorcycle helmets are ridiculously unsafe if you live in America. The Department of Transportation, DOT, standard is so low that bicycle helmets have passed it. QRD of this great video on it. Face shields are untested, a loose pebble could shatter it and it would still pass DOT. Companies can choose their own testers, they can and do choose the most lenient standards. Based on car accidents, not motorcycle crashes. Failure is 400 grams of impact. 290 grams is what cracks your fucking skull open. Chin bars were not tested. Roll-off is not tested. 20% of DOT approved helmets, when retested, did not pass. Minimal tests are announced, which is standard, but manufacturers can and do make helmets stronger in test areas, but nowhere else. I was cleaning the garage with my mom shortly after my dad died, and I found a very long, very sad breakup letter from my dad to my mom dated July 2, 1985. I asked her about it, what happened, and she kind of chuckled and went, "Oh. We got everything sorted out the next day and we're back together again." I was born 9 months later on April 1, 1986. I was the product of make-up sex and had the letter in my hand that started the events of my existence. Inuit have one of the highest suicide rates in the world. In Canada, the incidence is 10 times that of the rate of the rest of the Canadian population. Inuit 25 and under are driving the rate. One large study found that 80% of the suicides were by hanging. The same study found that about 1 in 6 of those who died by suicide were victims of sexual abuse. An admiral in the British Navy was killed by firing squad for not doing his utmost when ordered to claim the island of Minorca. Admiral Byng discovered the island had already been claimed by a French fleet and decided to turn his men around to save their lives rather than sail into suicide. Britain couldn't admit that France beat them to it and blamed the loss of Minorca on the admiral and sentenced him to die. They used newspaper comics and propaganda to spread misinformation about the admiral's incompetence to get the public behind his execution. Basically, this guy died because of nationalism. There's a new analysis of his career and death which was a part of why, recently, the Byng name cleared and the admiral was given back his honor. During World War II, Imperial Japan operated prisoner transports known colloquially as hell ships. As the name implies, conditions aboard them were downright atrocious. Prisoners were crammed into steaming hot, unventilated cargo holds to the point that it was basically standing room only. Food and water was incredibly sparse. There were no bathroom facilities, and abuse from the guards was commonplace. Death from starvation, infection, dysentery, dehydration, and so on was common, and more suffered from delirium due to the conditions. Many of these ships were sunk during the war, and oftentimes the vast majority prisoner of war cargo would be unable to escape and go down with the ships, the worst being Junyo Maru, sunk by the submarine HMS Tradewind with 5,620 prisoners of war and slave laborers. Though the Japanese gave no indication that these ships were carrying prisoners of war, and them also transporting soldiers and military equipment made them valid targets. Thanks for listening to Reddit Rundown. Give a thumbs up and subscribe, and help me get to 1,000 subs. Leave a comment below on what kind of topics or stories you would like to hear. You can also check out other videos on my channel. Thanks and have an awesome day.